Hi, welcome to the Catholic Corner. I'm Monsignor Walter Nolan. My guest today has been a volunteer emergency medical technician with the Spring Lake, New Jersey First Aid and Emergency Squad for the past 28 years. She's been also a physical therapist for 21 years. Andrea Jo Rogers is also the author of a most inspiring book, a book that we're going to discuss and share with you today. It's called At Heaven's Edge, True Stories of Faith and Rescue. I'm sure you're going to be alert to listen to the stories from Andrea. Her book highlights 29 stories, and pay attention to this, 29 stories of the 6,900 first aid and fire calls that Andrea has responded to over the years. God bless you. Wow. In each story, Andrea, with her beautiful faith, reflects the presence of Jesus. Andrea, her husband Rick, their 10-year-old twins, Lily and Thomas, are parishioners at one of our beautiful parishes down in Spring Lake, St. Catharein-St. Margaret Parish, Spring Lake, New Jersey. Andrea, most happy to have you. Welcome to the Catholic Corner.
So much.
My God, 6,900. My gosh, most people can't even walk that far. Oh my God, that's astounding. Astounding. Well, listen, before we get into your because I love stories, I can't wait to hear some of your stories. Before we get into your book a little bit, what decided, how did you get to volunteer, for the local volunteer fire and rescue squad?
Well, I was actually working as a beach cop in the beach office, as a beach clerk in the beach office. Oh. And one of the beach cops came in and he asked me to join the first aid squad. And at first I said no. I was really busy. I was going into my senior year of high school. I really didn't know anything about first aid. You
were in high school then?
I was the summer of my junior year. And I was in a lot of clubs in high school. I ran winter and spring track. I had a job. But for every reason that I gave not to join the first aid squad, he gave a reason that I should give it a try. And eventually I caved in, and I just couldn't think of an excuse good enough to satisfy him. So I joined as a cadet.
Wow. Now, as a young cadet, because maybe some are listening, they might want to join as young cadet.
You can join as young as 16 years old.
16?
I was 17.
And how many hours do you put in at the beginning?
Cadets aren't expected to put in as many hours because they have schoolwork, but every squad is a little bit different. With our squad, we try to answer about, at least 200 calls a year.
Have you been with the same squad all these years?
I have, yeah.
You must be like the captain or something.
Right now I'm the lieutenant. I have been the captain in the past.
There you go. My God, that is absolutely terrific. But listen, your book is beautiful. And I hope lots of people go out and purchase it or read it, get it in the library, or however they would want to do it. It's called At Heaven's Edge, True Stories of Faith and Rescue. Can you tell me a little bit about the book?
Right. So during my years with the First Aid Squad, I've witnessed some truly amazing things, and I wanted to be able to share them with people. Some of the stories in this book are what I would consider to be miracles. Some are sad, but more faith-filled, and a few are just funny. My hope when I wrote the book was that people would be inspired or comforted by the stories.
Well, I hope if you ever come to get me, it's a funny story, and not so serious. But you know what? I must tell you, that's God's work. The EMT people I know and folks, fire, police. I mean, you're the saints of the communities. You know that? Wow. It's just it's wonderful, and I think you should get all the praise in the world. That's wonderful stuff. So what inspired you to write the book? I mean, I'm sure you got lots of things to do. You're a mother of twins.
My son and I, a few years back, were in a terrifying elevator accident, and that event made me step back and take a close look at my life. And I thought about my relationship with God, my family, and my friends. I thought about my hopes and my dreams. And one of my lifelong dreams was to write a book. So the accident actually inspired me to start working on my writing.
Can you tell us a little bit about the accident?
Well, it was a beautiful morning in October, and my son was almost 3 at the time, and I took him to the eye doctor. And when we stepped out the door, I thought, usually I like to take the stairs. I'm a physical therapist, so we like exercise. But I thought, well, let's take the elevator. It'll be more exciting for him. And we stepped inside together, and he was learning his numbers, so we pressed the number 1 button together. And the ride was fine at first, but then there was this terrible crash and this horrible grinding metallic noise, unlike anything I had ever heard before in my life. And then water started gushing in under the bottom of the elevator doors. And at first, I just stared in shocked disbelief. And then I hoisted Thomas up into my arms as the water came up and over our ankles. And I started pressing the door open button. And when that didn't work, I started trying to push at the door to open it. But the water came up and over my knees. And at that point, if I hadn't lifted Thomas up, it would already have been over his head. So I screamed for help as loudly as I could. But as the water continued to rise, I thought we would surely drown. And then in that incredibly dark moment, God answered my prayers and the elevator doors opened.
Oh my gosh.
We had landed in a dark basement filled with water, and I could hear the water running everywhere. It was echoing off the cement
Was
walls.
this at the building where the doctor was?
Yes, yes. And there was a small window letting in some dim light, and I could make out the outline of a door. So I waded through the water with Thomas in my arms, and I jerked the door open, and fortunately, it was a flight of stairs. So the fire department came and the first aid squad came, and the fire chief said that the entire building, it was a big medical building, he said the whole building would have to be evacuated for the rest of the day due to the severe electrical hazard in the basement. Well, I had thought Thomas and I were going to drown. It hadn't even occurred to me that we were nearly electrocuted, but by the grace of God, we lived. And it turned out that there was a sprinkler main break that had flooded the basement. And I was actually really fortunate because it was my wedding anniversary and my husband had taken off from work. So he was at home with my daughter. And the last time I had gone to the eye doctor, I had both children in a double stroller, which would have been, of course, much worse.
Unbelievable. No wonder you're writing books with
Right.
gods and angels and miracles. And
Yep, guardian angels.
You know, when you have an experience like that, it does. I'm sure you look at your children's eyes and thank every moment.
Absolutely.
And when they spill the milk and put a baseball, you know, where it shouldn't
Not
be,
such
who
a big
cares?
deal anymore.
And that was on your anniversary.
That was on my
Well, I hope on all your other anniversaries, your beautiful husband, Rick, treats you very, very well.
He does.
And if he doesn't, you tell him I said so, okay? Well, listen, now let's get into so you first got interested in becoming a volunteer for the first aid squad?
Yes.
And
Yep, so that was, I was just 17 at the time, and that was when the beach cop came in and asked me to join, and the rest is history. I've been answering ever since. It's really been
what
a
are
great
the qualifications in case other folks would like to join? What would they have to
Sure.
do?
So to join our squad, first you need it to be interviewed so we can get to know you and pass a criminal background check. And then you can ride as an observer. So you can just kind of get your feet wet and see if you even like it. And if you do, then the next step would be to take a course in basic first aid and CPR. And if that goes well and you want to move on to the next step, then you could become an emergency medical technician. That's a 200-hour course, so it's a bit more of a time commitment.
It's like becoming a doctor.
It's heading that way, right? But it's a lot, you know,
really?
you need a lot of training to be able to adequately treat people, so.
And that led you to become a physical therapist.
Yeah, it did. When I originally applied to the College of William and Mary, I picked it because they have a really good business program. And then as I started to answer first aid calls, I realized I really liked the health-related fields, and I ended up becoming a physical therapist. So it completely changed the course of my life, truly.
You graduated William & Mary?
I graduated from William & Mary with my bachelor's, yeah.
Great, huh? And then after that, have you done further studying?
So then I went to Rutgers University and the University of Medicine and Dentistry for my Master of Physical Therapy, and I got my clinical doctorate in physical therapy from Shenandoah University.
Wow, wow. Where do you find time to still be part of the squad?
You know, I just fit it in.
Just
it's
do it.
evenings, weekends, nights.
Gosh. So now I think you know, out of the 6,900 rescues that you've been involved in and emergencies, there are 29 stories that you think are kind of the cream of the story.
The ones that really touched me.
And they're all in your book.
They are.
Are they real stories?
These are all true stories. Yes, I changed the names of all the people and places in the stories to protect privacy. So for example, the town I live in, I've now called Pine Cove. I changed the name of my son Thomas to John. The only names that are still the same are my own name, and I kept my husband, Rick, the same because I thanked him on the acknowledgments page, and I said, if I changed your name in the book, it might seem really confusing to people.
Yeah, after he's kind of rescued you on your anniversary.
Right, exactly.
Of course. No, that's terrific. Well, listen, how did you remember all these stories? Did you keep like a notebook during your time, or?
It was actually at my mother's suggestion back when I was in high school that she told me to keep a journal of the calls that were special to me. And when I decided to write the book, I went up into my attic and I dug the journal out of a box. And it was as if the patients sprang back to life again, and I could remember the calls as if they occurred yesterday.
Wow.
And then without that journal, I couldn't have written the book with such detail.
Oh, sure. What a great idea. That's a great idea for a lot of young people today if they're involved in some kind of, I call it ministry, because I think we're all ministers of God somehow or other, you know. So so you remember them really going back to your notes. Can you tell me a few of the stories? Can you share some of the stories, or how you cataloged them, or?
Well, I just cataloged them in the journal chronologically.
Okay.
It was just, you know, like a teenage girl's journal.
Yeah.
But I can tell you one of the stories, if you like,
sure.
That really touched me.
Love stories.
It's a chapter in the book, it's called Buried Alive. And at the time, I was working as a beach cop on the beach. It was when I was in college. And it was just after lunch. I was biking along on my beach cop bicycle, and my first aid pager went off. And the dispatcher said, request for first aid at the beach for a girl buried alive. And I thought, buried alive? How is that possible? Like, I know there's sand, but I'd never heard of such a thing. I was just a block away, so I biked there as fast as I could. And when I arrived, I could see the crowd was already forming on the beach behind the lifeguard stand. And I rushed over, and my boss, a police officer, was there, and he said, Andrea, there may be a young girl buried underneath the sand here somewhere.
Somewhere?
Start digging. Well, it turned out that the young girl was there with her grandfather, and she had been digging the hole all morning. And one of the volleyball players noticed that the hole was gone. So she went over to the grandfather and she said, where's the little girl who was digging the hole? And he said, I just saw her a couple minutes ago. And of course, he became very frightened. He said,
oh my God.
Maybe she went up to the bathroom. But they weren't sure. And the volleyball player, she was with another player was with her as well. She said, we need to start digging. So they notified the lifeguards. They called 911. And the lifeguards started digging. The volleyball players were all digging. Bystanders joined the effort. And then the first aid squad, we arrived. And so we didn't know exactly where she was buried. We knew like a general radius. And so we just began digging. And you know, with sand, as you start digging, some of it slides back. So it wasn't an easy effort. But we dug, and the minutes passed by, 1, 2, 3, and I thought, first of all, we weren't exactly sure if she was under the sand or not. And I was worried if she was, Was she going to be dead? Would she have brain damage? But all of a sudden, one of the gentlemen who was digging said, I think I see something. And sure enough, it was the top of her head. It was her hair. And so we dug out the rest of her head, and her face was perfectly blue. And I thought, oh my, I just said a prayer that she would be okay. And the police officer dug the sand out of her mouth, and then she took a deep breath, and we dug out the rest of her, and then she hugged her grandfather, and she was using her hands to wipe the sand away, and I thought, oh, she's going to be okay. It was a purposeful movement, but we took her to the hospital, and as it turned out, she was discharged the next day, and she was okay. She made a full recovery, no problems at all. So I just felt like God orchestrated that rescue to have such an observant group of volleyball players
And
in the right place.
I guess we're kids themselves in a way, or
Yeah, a little older,
college
yeah,
kids.
like 20s, I guess.
They're all kids.
But that they persevered, and they said, no, we're going to dig, and thank God they did. And I felt like all the pieces came together to save her life.
How below the sand was she?
She was 12 years old, and she was buried completely vertically in the sand. So the hole was maybe like 5 feet deep or so.
She was vertical in the sand.
She was perfectly vertical in the sand. She had dug and dug the hole, and then it just caved in on her. So, but that's one of the ones that sticks in my memory.
Could I ask you about how long ago was that? About?
That was during my college years. So we're saying about like 25 years ago.
25 years ago, and she was 5. So that young lady
she was
now
12 then. Yep.
is like 30 now.
Yeah. Yep.
And
so
probably, if we use our imagination, maybe a young mother.
Yep. She wasn't a local, so I have no idea, where she went from there. We just found out. Sometimes as first aid squad members, we never find out how people do, but we were blessed to find out that she made a full recovery. So.
But that is God.
That was God at work.
That's the guardian angel stuff.
Yeah.
That is absolutely. Would this ever happen? Do you think? You have 29 stories in the book. Mm-hmm. You just told me about a beautiful young girl who was brought back to her grandpop and whatever else. And maybe now she's a young mother at about 30. I wonder if she would ever be sitting someplace or buy the book and read it and say, well, that sounds like me.
That sounds familiar. That happened to me once.
Can you
Grandpa,
imagine?
where was I when that happened?
Can you imagine?
Wow. Can you imagine if he went home without their granddaughter? Wow. And I sometimes thought, too, what if they thought she got abducted? Like, what if they didn't realize she was actually buried? Anything could have, right? So.
When you said about her grandfather, I had a nephew who was a very special child person. And when we were younger, this uncle guy thought, I'm going to take him fishing. Now, my sister-in-law said, fine, go ahead. Well, and he was a very challenged young man. Well, we were fishing on the beach, and it got a little dark, and he got cold, and he said, go get your sweater. I was trying to make him, grow up. Well, he didn't come back, for a little bit of time. And just like you said, I'm running up and down the beach,
Yeah.
Well, and all I kept thinking about was, oh, my God, how would I ever go home to my sister without her son? Mm-hmm. And that's a little bit of the story you're telling.
Yeah.
Oh, my God, Andrea. So okay, that's a serious story.
Yeah.
I think you said there were a couple of funny stories.
A couple of funny ones,
Can you tell a little
too.
funny story?
Sure. So again, these are all from my early years on the squad.
Yeah.
Our captain asked for a few volunteers for a first aid call that would be taking place in a couple days. And the only hitch was that we had to wear we had at the time these very unattractive white polyester jumpsuits, which I would have never worn in public. But to be on the call, we had to wear those jumpsuits. So I said, okay, I'm in. I'll wear the jumpsuit. So we had no idea what it was, but we knew that we had to be available it was like 6 o'clock on a certain evening. So the 3 of us that he chose were at the building. Our pager goes off, and they said it was for a murder at one of the local hotels. And I thought, a murder? Like, what is going on? We knew something was up. But so we go over, and our driver said, is the scene safe? And the dispatcher said, it's secure, you can go in. So we enter the hotel, and there wasn't anyone in the lobby, so we go to the dining room and we step in. And you could see that there was a man lying on the dance floor, spread-eagled, blood all pouring out of his chest and his white shirt. And then the spotlights went on to us. It was a murder mystery show.
Oh, like those dinner things?
Yes, the dinner things. And the people in the audience were local, so they recognized us as real First Aid Squad members, and they started to clap and cheer and holler. So, of course, we were very serious. We went over and we did the whole, we stayed in character, and we removed him from the scene. But that was one of the more fun ones that I was on.
See, God also has a sense of humor.
Right.
How about another story that you can think of that maybe have you ever? Oh, I'm sure you have. I shouldn't say have you ever, but maybe somehow you're part of helping someone get to the hospital or whatever it happens to be, and meet them maybe later, a year or two later, or something like that. Does that ever come around?
It does come around sometimes. Another call like that was there. We had a first aid call. I was at home with my family. We were eating dinner, and my first aid pager went off. And they said 1 or 2 people possibly falling unconscious. And I remember my mom said, 2 people falling unconscious? And I said, I don't know. We will sometimes have 2 calls in the same house at the same time. Sometimes it's food poisoning. Sometimes one person falls and the other tries to catch them. But so we headed over, and before we got there, my pager went off again, and they said, change of location. The call is actually now next door. So let me back up a little bit. What was going on in that house was that an older married couple who happened, my mom was friends with the woman, they had gotten home from food shopping, unpacked their groceries, and they were putting them away, made a little bit of dinner, and she felt tired. She didn't really feel that great. So they had a bite to eat. She went into the living room to sit down with her husband. They were watching TV, and she said to him, I really don't feel well. And he wanted to get up to see what was wrong, and he realized he couldn't really move. Like, he couldn't get up. And she started going unconscious. He was able to reach the telephone, and he called the police department, and he could barely say anything. All he could do was say, help. And so the dispatcher, this is a while ago, so the technology wasn't as advanced then, but he was able to do a reverse lookup and figure out where they lived. Well, the police officers arrived, and they broke the door down, and they were able to lift the married couple up out of the chairs and carry them. It was a bitterly cold day. They carried them next door to the neighbor's house, hence the change of address for us. And so when we got there, we started assisting the 2, and the woman was a little worse off, and we had to use an ambu bag to breathe for her. She wasn't breathing on her own. And I recognized her, and I thought, oh dear God, like, not my mom's friend, not anyone, and so as we breathed for her, she started to come around, and I ended up taking him to the hospital. We kind of switched patients. And he couldn't understand what was wrong, and I said, well, the fire department is going to investigate. We thought perhaps they had a carbon monoxide poisoning because their lips were cherry red, and they were vomiting, and so it kind of, the lethargy. So on the way to the hospital, my first aid pager went off again, and it was for his house. And they said a car was left on in the garage, possible carbon monoxide poison, a situation. So we left the channel open so we could hear what was going on, and then they checked his flu as well. But and I was really touched because he was so worried about the firemen getting injured more than his house. He wanted to put their safety first. But people like that, it's a very small town, so a lot of times, especially if it's someone visiting the town, I don't get to follow up with them. But in other instances, we know them. And one of the last stories in the book, I saved one of the best for last. I stayed friends with that family to this day.
Well, tell us quickly a little bit about that story.
I'll tell you a little bit. The gentleman is called Saving Mr. O'Leary, different name, of course. He was taking a walk on the boardwalk in the morning, and he very suddenly went into cardiac arrest.
Okay.
And it
Okay.
kind of goes from there.
Okay. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I just hope everybody gets your book and reads all these stories. I probably have a homily or two out of them. How long did it take you to write the book about?
It took about 2 years to write the book in total, but in the middle of that, I had to take an 8-month break to get certified as a lymphedema therapist for work. And the day I passed that national exam, I was so happy because I could start working on my book again.
Super. Now, I know there's a lot of prayer. It's part of the chapters of prayer.
Every chapter I lead off with a Bible verse, which I try to match to the theme of the chapter.
And does that kind of impact your own prayer life?
I think it does. I try to say a quick prayer for my patients, especially if they're in a state of severe illness or cardiac arrest. And sometimes I'll pray for the family if the person has passed on.
Wow. Wow.
You know.
So you really,
It only takes a second to say a prayer. It's no extra time.
I'm going to speak for your husband. You're an angel. That's just wonderful. Do you ever pray with your patients? I know you're a physical therapist, and that might be a little hard, but does that ever happen?
Occasionally, if they ask us to pray with them or for them, they will occasionally. But more so on first aid calls, they might ask us to pray with them. Physical therapists, patients ask us to pray for them.
Well, the prayer's a multitudinous way of praying. Just so maybe you know, most of the time, if I'm driving a car and one of your vehicles goes past me or the other way, sometimes I say a little prayer for who's ever, like folks like you, and just a little sign of the cross and a blessing and say, Lord, go with them because they're going to need it. So maybe somehow the prayers, they keep going around and around and around.
So true.
Did you already tell me one of your favorite stories? Is that
Buried Alive? I would say is one of my favorite stories, and Saving Mr. O'Leary. I like all of them. But like I said,
I even like
some
your
of them are
title,
more
Saving
happy.
Mr. O'Leary. That sounds wonderful.
Right.
Where'd you get your book published?
Through Harvest House Publishers. It's a Christian publishing house. And I had sent, when I created the book, I sent a proposal to a literary agent named Les Stobie. And he sent the proposal back with some suggestions, which I took to heart. So I sent him a revised proposal, and then he offered to represent me. And he was the one who found Harvest House. And fortunately, they were willing to take a chance on me.
Terrific. Now the book is in your heart?
Well, I've already written a second book.
Good.
And the first book, At Heaven's Edge, is selling well right now. So Harvest House just invited me to submit a proposal for a second book.
Terrific.
So hopefully.
Andrea, please keep that love of God in your smile, your love. Catholic Corner, please read At Heaven's Edge. Beautiful book. And I'm sure you'll be able to get it many different places. Andrea, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Wish we had another half hour here. God almighty. That is just marvelous. And storytelling.